Good evening, listeners. Welcome to another Inspector Purbright mystery from the delightfully peculiar town of Flaxborough. When Flaxborough's cultural evening turns to sabotage, Inspector Purbright discovers that amateur dramatics can be deadly serious. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you settled in somewhere cozy in the English countryside, or perhaps tuning in from across the Atlantic? The Corn Exchange had been brushed up to suggest distinction, the way a pensioned spaniel will be trifled with to imply renewed youth. There were chrysanthemums in municipal vases along the window sills and a smell of floor polish that could only have been achieved by a concerned man on his knees shortly before tea. A string-tied placard announced, without enthusiasm, "A Flaxborough Cultural Evening. The Arts Circle presents a program of voice and music." In collaboration with the B.B.C., people had dressed as if the wireless could see them. The ladies of the Arts Circle had outpaced the chrysanthemums in their determination to bloom, and the aldermen, in waistcoats that treated buttons as a matter of policy rather than success, were confidently framed under the great, dusty velvet draperies that had hung at the back of all memorable Flaxborough embarrassments since 1912. Behind that velvet there was bustle. Mr. Lionel Spinks, director of the Flaxborough Dramatic and Musical Union, was completing, with a piece of chalk and a very confidential expression, a triangular shape on the stage floor. "Don't step outside, dears," he said to the cast, "or the microphones will lose you." He drew himself up and smiled at the nearest microphone, which belonged proprietorially to the British Broadcasting Corporation and had been afforded a small aura of sanctity by 2 coils of cable and a neat metal stand. "Mr. Mallison from the corporation, looks thin enough to make noise by breathing, but somehow not in need of oxygen," spoke to his assistant in sentences that ended sooner than expected. "Local councillors. Yes. Mayor to greet. Then him, is it? No. Spoken monologue. Ah." He glanced at the velvet curtain as if it might be a novel sort of animal. It watched him, immense and discreet, with the gravity only cloth knows. Mrs. Vera Pallithorpe, chairwoman of the Arts Circle, swept to and fro with a clipboard that lent dignity to her sense of siege. She was a handsome woman whose hats were large enough to make other people walk carefully. "We shall not be provincial," she told herself aloud, which made several provincial people radiate hostility. "We shall be brisk and charming," she told Mr. Spinks, who had never in his life been either. By the aisle near the back stood Inspector Purbright, who had been invited, with the air of a favour being done him, by the mayor to lend an air of orderliness to the evening. Purbright had discovered over the years that nothing gave order to a gathering like the hope of hearing oneself on the wireless. He watched the arrangement of the dignitaries with mild interest. Sergeant Love, at his side, confined himself to nodding at those he recognized and not staring at those he did not. "Nice turnout," Love murmured. "Lot of committee?" "Committees would fill stadiums," Purbright said. "It's their private wish." The mayor, Councillor Edgar Mallow, was being held at bay by a buttonhole carnation. He kept examining it with that curious flicker of the lips, the sincerely self-conscious reserve for mirrors and floral anxieties. A small man whose surname had benefited quite handsomely from the inclusion of "and Sons" painted upon vans, he had lately seen to the refurnishing of the Corn Exchange with a confidence that flattered both his eye for curtains and his firm's balance sheet. The evening began, as such things begin in Flaxborough, with an insinuation of bustle into something like order. Mr. Mallison inclined his head to the mayor. The mayor, rewarded, cleared his throat into a weighted silence and produced the vowel sounds he kept for civic occasions. "Friends," he said, audibly unready to be the kind of friend he proposed, "tonight our little town, not so little perhaps, in the estimation of those who know the worth of it." He paused to allow the estimation of worth to circulate. Somebody at the back coughed, and somebody else, thinking it time to sympathize, coughed too. The velvet curtain, which had seen mayors pause before, saved the man by quivering. There was a minor commotion behind it, a sort of subdued muscularity, and a curious little scuffing noise like a broom making up its mind. Several members of the audience craned, and Mrs. Palethorpe, who had a military relations eyesight, darted up the side stairs like a woman pursuing an idea she disliked. From behind the curtain, in the folded gloom, came a muffled oof, the sort of noise a person makes when discarding dignity to accept gravity. The mayor stopped. Mr. Malleson lifted a hand as if to conduct the invisible. Lionel Spinks cried, "Hold!" in a voice that had dreamed of saying it to a full orchestra and woke to find a mixed chorus of haberdashers and clerks. Purbright took the steps at a pace that meant no hurry. The side of the velvet was parted by a hand whose fingers suggested a life of shopping lists. Behind the curtain, the old plank stage stored its dust conscientiously. It also now stored Mr. Oswald Tudge, prompter and proprietor of Tudge's Drapery. Ladies and infants, in a sitting position at a surprising angle, with his foot entangled in a length of curtain cord. "Don't fuss," Mr. Tudge said with patriotic spirit. His left temple had a little bruise that made a statement. "I went to fetch my prompt copy from the—" He gestured vaguely toward a chair that disagreed with being blamed. "Prompters," Lionel Spinks announced to the general stage, "ought to be heard but never seen." He looked at Tudge as if the man had turned up in bathing drawers. "Fetch him a chair," Mrs. Palethorpe said, discovering that Mr. Tudge already had two in some sense attached to him. She looked at Purbright. "Inspector, it's nothing. A slip." "Indeed," said Purbright. He knelt carefully. Dust had its own reputation, and with an easy movement relieved Mr. Tudge of the more determined ligatures. The rope fell obediently over his hands. He ran it between forefinger and thumb, glanced at the cleat where such cords are tethered, and then at the sandbag that counterweighted the velvet sea. He might have been a man guessing the weight of oranges. "It was tied," Mr. Tudge said with the righteousness of a man who dislikes being made to look improbable. "I don't tie my own ankles in my own town. Not at my age." "Somebody's idea of a rehearsal joke," Lionel declared, and the phrase rehearsal joke carried in it the history of 1,000 small resentments. The tangle was sorted. Mr. Tudge, restored to vertical, found his prompt copy absent and his sense of grievance present. "It was here," he muttered, patting a place on the wooden stool with the proprietary indignation of a cat whose cushion has been borrowed. "I had it marked. Tissue-colored slips. Now look." He spread unhelpfully open hands. Those near him looked, because it is expected. On the seat of the stool lay a small square of paper, pinned to the baize with a fine dressmaker's pin. It said, very plainly, in neat type, "Not tonight." Mrs. Palethorpe removed the paper as one removes an insect from a sandwich. Who did this? She demanded of the entire company, and because nobody admitted to it, she demanded with an adjusted emphasis of the fewer, then the smaller, and ended accusing Mr. Tudge himself with her eyes. "Trifling," she concluded to settle the matter by declaration. "Mr. Malleson, do proceed. We are not a music hall." They proceeded. The mayor found his place and sent it off with a little push of the voice. The audience, chastened into enjoyment, smiled raptly at a microphone. Mr. Malleson leaned towards his assistant. "Levels low," he murmured. The assistant turned, made professional adjustments, and discovered what the adjustments were not correcting. He followed the cable like Theseus in the opposite direction. The audience, which had been delighting in the novel experience of hearing Flaxborough at amplified volume, stopped delighting. The mayor's words altered from sounding official to sounding like a gentleman in a draughty hall. Mr. Malleson lifted a hand again, and the mayor stood suddenly in a still life with carnation. The assistant reappeared from behind the velvet curtain with a length of cable like a snake that had been tidily beheaded. "Cut," he said to Mr. Malleson with commendable brevity, showing the end. The copper inside was not frayed or chewed, but decisively tidy. He glanced towards the back of the stage, towards the gloom around the fly tower where stands and ropes performed their discreet labors. "Bit thick," said the assistant. His expression did not, however, exclude admiration for a cut so clean. Mrs. Palethorpe had either seen the cable or deduced it, her mouth thinned by a sovereign 16th of an inch. "Well," she said, "we shall return with what we planned." And her glance at the assembled company suggested that someone present had ideas above their station and below their breeding. Purbright had returned to his place at the side to be out of everybody's way and nobody's notice. Love leaned towards him. "Cut cable," he whispered. "Somebody's treat." "It does sound like sabotage," Purbright said, in the tone of a man remarking on the weather one can do nothing about. He had the "Not Tonight" paper in his pocket because Mrs. Palethorpe had handed it, with the careful imprecision of people passing on responsibility and germs, to the nearest official object. The type was standard. The pin was of the kind Mr. Tudge might have sold by the ounce. He looked up at the velvet curtain, at the hem where a seam had been let out sometime in the past, where the thread was not the precise color of the cloth. A small, neat darn at roughly knee-height on the right-hand edge caught his eye. A careful hand, perhaps from a house where time ran a little slower and needles lived in cushions. Purbright's gaze drifted then to the ring of aldermen settled in their row and the gentle lounging of junior clerks behind them, to the gallery where Miss Tiddy from the lending library was already composing a manageable anecdote, and to the back wall radiator where a glossy program, abandoned, leaned as if in repose. He did not pursue it. He let his eyes half close like a man who was hearing something being said in another room. Mr. Malleson, with the detachment of a considerate undertaker, declared that the delay had become an interval. Tea was summoned. Tea in the Corn Exchange arrived not as refreshment, but as an argument finally concluded. It came in thick cups native to all social democratic events, and it quieted righteous indignation as surely as chloroform denies memory. Gossip went to work as trained. The Reverend Bream, a pale clergyman of sincere whisper, explained to Mrs. Palethorpe that people without religion were drawn to cut cables. The councillors confided to each other, and from time to time to anybody else with a collar, that union men had a way of proving points at inconvenient moments. Miss Larkin, drinking her tea as if it had not been in a kettle, smiled past her cup at a man by the door whom she perhaps did not know, or perhaps knew very well. Mr. Tudge, re-engineered and heroic, told his wife in the third row that it was nothing but a trip, and that he liked a bruise. It proved one's blood was good and near the surface. "Who'd cut a thing like that?" Love asked, chiefly to have said it. "The kind of person," Purbright said, "who is more interested in the being cut than the thing." He watched Mr. Mallison's assistant run the new cable like a patient weaver. Beyond him, in the space between leg curtain and wall, stood the remote loom of ropes and counterweights, the theatre's innards, both simple and, to the unpracticed, very nearly a belief. When the interval was nearly over, the mayor, having recovered his vowels, practiced them under his breath. This had a soothing effect upon him and upon no one else. Mrs. Palethorpe rehearsed dignified forgiveness. Lionel's Sphinx stalked. Mr. Tudge looked under things with a passion usually reserved for finding mislaid infants. Purbright, who had seen many things, declared, watched the mayor resume his speech and the B.B.C. resume their serenity. He listened to the words about Flaxborough's spirit and Flaxborough's place. He took in, without needing to look as if he did, the way Miss Larkin's eyes slid sideways at certain names and the way Mr. Tudge's jaw set when it was suggested that volunteers were the backbone of all worthy enterprises. He also considered the person behind a curtain who ties a knot that makes sense to nobody but the hand that tied it, and what kind of courtesy they might be paying to the town. On the far side of the stage, by the radiator, the glossy program still leaned. The breeze from the opening doors lifted a corner and showed, for a moment only, a name ringed in pencil. No one claimed it. The evening, thus reassured by its own continuation, forgot it on purpose. Morning arrived in Flaxborough with the sort of determined cheerfulness that makes sensible people suspicious. By 9 o'clock, the previous evening's peculiar entertainment had been thoroughly digested by the town's conversational apparatus, and was being served up in portions that bore only a passing resemblance to what had actually occurred. At Potts the butcher, where lamb cutlets maintained a dignified silence about their circumstances, the consensus held that the B.B.C. brought its own brand of metropolitan mischief. Wire cutters declared Mrs. Demock with the authority of a woman who had once seen London from a train window. They carry them like other people carry umbrellas. The postman, whose expertise in cables extended to telephone wires and clotheslines, suggested that professional sabotage didn't leave bruises on innocent prompters. Amateur work, he concluded, done by someone with a grievance and no proper tools. At the lending library, Miss Tiddy had catalogued the various theories under local interest and found them wanting in both logic and literary merit. A person, she informed Miss Larkin, who was returning a volume on wildflower pressing, has typed a message and pinned it to a human being as if he were a notice board. That is not civilized behavior. Miss Larkin, whose complexion suggested that harsh words made her physically uncomfortable, smiled with the vague distinction of someone who preferred books to people and found both preferable to controversy. Inspector Purbright had arrived at his desk earlier than usual, not from urgency, but because sleep had proved elusive. He had spent the small hours considering the curious mathematics of the evening's events. How much effort someone had invested in achieving so remarkably little. Sergeant Love appeared at 9 sharp, bearing tea and the expression of a man who had been listening. "Talk in the town," Love reported, settling the cup with ceremonial care. "Mrs. Brackenridge says, Mr. Tudge was in the post office first thing, buying stamps he didn't need and asking about registered post to London. Thick envelope, business size. Mr. Tudge appears to have developed a sudden correspondence," Purbright observed. "What else has Mrs. Brackenridge's postal intelligence revealed?" Mrs. Palathorpe was at the library, asking Miss Tiddy about books on theatrical management. Specifically wanted to know about historical precedents for disruption in amateur dramatic circles. Purbright sipped his tea thoughtfully. In Flaxborough, the purchase of unnecessary stamps ranked somewhere between suspicious behavior and positive evidence of guilt, while researching historical precedents suggested either scholarly thoroughness or the preparation of alibis. They walked to the Corn Exchange, where Mr. Prindle, caretaker and philosopher of cleaning implements, displayed the severed cable ends with paternal sorrow. "Nipped clean," he said, "like for roses." Professional cut, that. The cupboard where spare cables lived had been rearranged by someone with different ideas about organization. Keys, it emerged, existed in a modest democracy. One for Mr. Prindle, one for the council clerk, one for Mrs. Palathorpe, worn soberly on a ribbon, and a venerable spare kept in the stage manager's drawer for emergencies that looked better solved from inside. Purbright examined the typewritten note again, observing how the letter T sat slightly low, as though ashamed of its position. He made no comment about typewriters, but considerable mental notes about the kind of person who left messages pinned to other people. "We shall call on people," he told Love in the tone of a man proposing a pleasant afternoon's bird-watching. "Mr. Spinks is a person. Miss Larkin is another." The church clock marked noon with 12 decisive throat clearings, and Flaxborough, having thoroughly enjoyed its morning's speculation, prepared to be interviewed about it. Mr. Lionel Spinks received them in a front parlour where theatrical ambitions had been carefully arranged for display. Framed photographs of amateur productions gazed down from every surface, and a piano bore the dignified scars of scales practiced with more enthusiasm than skill. Spinks himself appeared in what he would have termed afternoon dress, and what a less theatrical man might have called a cardigan with pretensions. "Inspector," he declared with the measured gravity of a man delivering bad news to royalty, "this assault upon our cultural endeavors strikes at the very heart of Flaxborough's artistic soul." He gestured toward chairs that had clearly been positioned for maximum dramatic effect. Purbright settled himself with the patience of a man who understood that theatrical people, like cats, required time to arrange themselves properly. "We're simply trying to understand the sequence of events, Mr. Spinks. You mentioned last evening that such incidents might be rehearsal jokes." "A diplomatic phrase," Spinks admitted, clasping his hands with conscientious precision. "One says such things to preserve dignity in the face of the inexplicable. But that cable cut, Mr. Prindle was quite right. Professional work, clean as surgery." He paused, adjusting a small bust of Shakespeare that seemed to disapprove of the conversation. "And poor Tudge with that rope. The man is fussy to the point of neurosis about his prompt copy, marks everything with tissue slips, treats it like a legal document. He would never entangle himself accidentally." "The prompt copy," Love said with casual interest. He seemed quite distressed about its disappearance. "Found it this morning, actually. Under the piano in St. Bartholomew's vestry. We use the space for costume storage when the hall's unavailable. How it got there." Spinks spread his hands in a gesture encompassing the mysterious migrations of theatrical properties. Purbright made a mental note about prompt copies that traveled without their owner's knowledge. "Who among your company would have the technical knowledge for such precise cable cutting?" Spinks considered this with the gravity of a casting director. "Young Ferris helps with rigging. Railway man, understands ropes and pulleys. Miss Larkin's father was a ship's carpenter. She sometimes advises on practical matters. Mrs. Palethorpe claims no technical knowledge, though her late husband was in engineering." He paused thoughtfully. "Of course, anyone with eyes can see how stage mechanics work. It's hardly advanced science." The conversation revealed the usual theatrical ecosystem of minor grievances and artistic disagreements, each delivered with a weight of cosmic significance. When they took their leave, Purbright noticed a framed photograph from the previous year's Christmas production. Miss Larkin stood in the back row, partially obscured by taller performers, her smile suggesting the particular contentment of those who preferred supporting roles. At the library, silence was cultivated with the patient devotion usually reserved for prize orchids. Miss Tiddy presided over the main desk like a benevolent sentry, while Miss Larkin moved among the stacks with the gentle precision of someone who understood that books, like people, preferred to be handled carefully. "Miss Larkin," Purbright said, approaching with the considerate manner of a man who recognized shyness as a form of intelligence, "we're hoping you might help clarify some details about last evening." She turned, her eyes widening slightly, the color, he noted, of a calm sea before weather. "Of course, Inspector. Though I'm afraid I didn't see very much clearly. It was all rather unsettling." "You were present for the entire evening?" "Yes, though I arrived a few minutes late. Mrs. Palethorpe had asked me to help with programs." She hesitated, then added, "I did notice some movement just before Mr. Tudge fell. Near the back curtain, as if someone had stepped away into the shadows by the fly tower. And later, when the cable was discovered, I saw Mr. Mallison's assistant looking up toward the rigging, almost as if he expected to see someone there." Purbright nodded encouragingly. "The note that was pinned to Mr. Tudge's stool, not tonight. Did the phrasing suggest anything to you?" Miss Larkin colored faintly. "It seemed so definite, like a statement rather than a jest. Quite decisive." "We're examining various typewriters in town," Purbright said with the casual air of a man discussing the weather. "Would you mind demonstrating yours?" "Just to eliminate it from our inquiries." Miss Tiddy gestured toward the underwood on the counter. "You're welcome to it, Inspector." The thing behaves like a temperamental child. Badly, but with variety. The tea key is particularly disgraceful. Miss Larkin moved to the machine with obvious reluctance and, at Purbright's gentle request, typed, "Not tonight." The tea drooped noticeably, sitting low and ashamed in its position. She stepped back quickly, as if the machine might bite. "Thank you," Purbright said, studying the result with the interest of a man comparing handwriting samples. "Most helpful." As they prepared to leave, he noticed Miss Larkin watching him with the expression of someone who had suddenly remembered where she had put something and rather wished she had not. The small darn on her cardigan sleeve caught the afternoon light, careful needlework, the kind that suggested time moved more slowly in some houses than others. Walking back toward the station, Love observed that Miss Larkin seemed genuinely nervous about the typewriter demonstration. Purbright agreed, adding that genuine nervousness, like genuine puzzlement, often provided the most reliable compass for an investigation. "The tea key matches," Love said. "Indeed it does," Purbright replied, along with several other interesting correspondences. Miss Larkin, it appears, has been paying closer attention to recent events than she might prefer us to know. The afternoon sun slanted through the library windows behind them, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny secrets in the air, each one carrying its own small truth toward an inevitable settling. The walk back to the station brought them past Tudge's drapery, where bolts of fabric stood in orderly ranks like a textile regiment awaiting inspection. Mr. Tudge himself emerged from behind a display of autumn woolens, his temple bearing a small dressing that lent him an air of dignified martyrdom. "Inspector," he said with the measured gravity of a man who had survived public embarrassment and lived to invoice another day, "I trust you've made progress with our theatrical saboteur." "We're pursuing several lines of inquiry," Purbright replied with the diplomatic vagueness that encouraged confidences. "Your prompt copy, I understand, has been recovered." "Yes, though how it reached St. Bartholomew's vestry remains a complete mystery. Found it this morning under the piano, marked exactly as I'd left it, all my tissue slips intact." Tudge's expression suggested that prompt copies, like respectable citizens, should remain where they were put. "The rope that entangled me was no accident either, Inspector. A slip knot, if you must know. The kind that tightens under pressure. Whoever tied it understood rope work." This technical detail settled into Purbright's mental collection with the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle piece finding its proper place. A slip knot suggested nautical knowledge, or at least familiarity with practical rope work, information that considerably narrowed the field in a town where most residents' experience with knots extended no further than shoelaces and parcel string. "The note pinned to your stool," Love said, producing it with careful precision. "Dressmaker's pin, you mentioned." Tudge peered at it with professional interest. "Indeed. Fine quality. Last packet of these went to Miss Larkin just last week, for some library project involving tiny labels. She's always been particular about her needlework." At the post office, Mrs. Brackenridge presided behind her grill with the omniscient satisfaction of someone whose professional duties aligned perfectly with natural curiosity. "Mr. Tudge's registered letter," she confirmed, leaning forward conspiratorially. "London address, legal firm by the look of it. Quite thick, several pages. Posted it priority too, and Mrs. Palathorpe's been busy with correspondence. Several letters to theatrical societies in neighboring towns asking about incidents of sabotage in amateur productions." The railway yard presented Ferris in his natural element, examining a coupling with the professional attention of a man who understood that mechanical failures, like human ones, usually announced themselves to those who knew how to listen. His weathered face suggested that both weather and railways had been reliable colleagues. "Clean cut on that cable, you say?" Ferris considered this with the measured appreciation of a craftsman evaluating another's work. "Not my pocket knife, then." Besides, I wasn't there to do cutting. 6 till 10, I was on the down line. Mr. Beebe can vouch for that. Coupling like a sulking mule. People mentioned seeing you near the fly tower earlier, Love said pleasantly. During rehearsal. Ferris grinned without particular warmth. I keep folk from hanging themselves with the curtains mostly, and I lend what tools I've got when needed. B.B.C. fellow borrowed my cable nippers to open a crate. Said their toolkit had gone astray in transit. Returned them later, clean as a new penny. He paused thoughtfully. If there's cutting neat enough to make your hair stand up, I'd ask someone whose work depends on precision. Did you notice anyone moving in the tower shadows last evening? Purbright asked with studied casualness. Quiet feet, Ferris said immediately. Someone who knows where the boards creak and where they don't. Not a newcomer to the place, I'd say. Back at the Corn Exchange, Mr. Prindle produced, with the quiet triumph of a collector, a program retrieved from beside the radiator. A penciled ring circled the listing. Monologue, Sea Voices, Miss Constance Larkin. Love frowned at the marking. She didn't perform, though. No, Purbright said, examining the small, decisive loop of pencil. She did not. He folded the program carefully, as if it contained something fragile. As they walked through the market square, the afternoon's gossip had begun its inevitable crystallization around a convenient target. What had been general outrage against an unknown saboteur was settling, like sediment in still water, around the quiet figure of Miss Larkin. Her shyness, previously seen as charming reticence, was being reinterpreted as furtiveness. Her preference for books over social gatherings had become evidence of an antisocial, perhaps resentful nature. At the Flaxborough Gazette, Mr. Horace Grimshaw was already composing headlines that managed to combine civic pride with veiled accusation. The public likes a tidy explanation, Inspector, he said, tapping his pen against his teeth. Miss Larkin is convenient, quiet, unmarried, no obvious connections to defend her, and the evidence does seem to point in her direction. Evidence, Purbright observed mildly, has a curious way of pointing wherever people most wish to look. That evening in his office, Purbright arranged the day's discoveries on his desk like a patient card player examining his hand. The borrowed nippers returned suspiciously clean. The slip knot that spoke of maritime knowledge. The marked program suggesting a cancelled performance. The typewriter with its telltale drooping T. The dressmaker's pins sold to a woman known for precise needlework. He considered how each piece might fit with the others, and how the town's eagerness to find a culprit might be obscuring rather than illuminating the truth. In his experience, the most interesting crimes often arose not from grand passions, but from the accumulation of small irritations, like sediment settling until it became solid enough to cause genuine trouble. The church clock struck 7, and Purbright locked his desk without having drawn any definitive lines between the names on his blotter. Tomorrow, he reflected, would require a more direct approach to untangling what someone had taken considerable care to knot. Morning arrived with the anonymous persistence of someone settling old accounts. Purbright found an envelope slipped beneath the station door, bearing his name in the familiar typeface with its apologetic drooping T. Inside, a message of calculated brevity. The truth is not what it appears. Look to the shadows cast by bright lights. A friend. Our correspondent with the temperamental typewriter, Purbright observed to Love, appears to have developed a taste for cryptic guidance. He held the paper to the light, noting the library stock quality, either genuinely concerned or professionally mischievous. The B.B.C. van presented Mr. Malison in the process of departure, his thin frame radiating the particular efficiency of someone who apologized by existing competently. His assistant Pierce worked among the coiled cables with the reverent care usually reserved for sleeping serpents. Unfortunate about your missing toolkit, Purbright said conversationally. Malison paused in his supervision. Discovered it gone this morning when accounting to headquarters. We carry duplicates, naturally, but the cable nippers—" He gestured toward Pierce, who colored slightly. "I borrowed Ferris's cutters to open the microphone crate," Pierce said. "Returned them proper, clean as new. But the cut on our cable wasn't at the crate end at all, Inspector. It was near the backstage feed. Clean work, yes, but placed to make our delay seem amateur." "Professional sabotage disguised as incompetence," Purbright mused. "How flattering to no one involved." At the Corn Exchange, mister. Prindle was conducting his morning communion with dust and disorder. He led them to the fly tower where sandbags hung in patient suspension, counterweighting the velvet curtain's theatrical ambitions. "Something's been adjusted here," Prindle said, indicating a sandbag that sat slightly off its customary mark. "And this knot," he pointed to where rope met cleat. "That's not my work. I tie simple hitches, practical-like. This here's a fisherman's bend. Proper seamanship, that." Love consulted his notebook. "Different from the slip knot that caught Mr. Tudge?" "Entirely different," Purbright said, examining the intricate turns of rope. "Two distinct types of maritime knowledge. The slip knot suggests general seamanship. The fisherman's bend indicates more specialized training. They found the library subdued by Miss Larkin's first absence in 3 years. Miss Tiddy presided with the particular melancholy of someone whose reliable colleague had become unreliable. Quite unlike her, Miss Tiddy explained, adjusting books with unnecessary precision. Called in poorly, voice barely above a whisper. And the typewriter's been acting more temperamental than usual. Several keys stick when the weather's damp." Purbright examined the machine again, noting how the ribbon seemed clearer than before, as if recently. Adjusted. "When did you last change the ribbon?" "Months ago. We order from Whitfield's in bulk. Expensive things, ribbons. Though I noticed yesterday it was typing more clearly, as if someone had seen to the mechanism." At Tudge's drapery, they found the proprietor arranging autumn woolens with the dignity of a man whose bruise had become a badge of civic service. "The knots, mister." "Tudge," Purbright said pleasantly. "You mentioned slip knots and bowlines. What are fishermen's bends?" Tudge's expression sharpened with professional interest. "Specialized work, that. My father taught me parceling knots. This requires proper seamanship. Miss Larkin could manage it, her father being ship's carpenter. Ferris might know it from his railway days, working around dock cargo. Even Mr. Spinks claims nautical knowledge from his theatrical research. A town surprisingly rich in maritime expertise, Purbright observed, for somewhere so determinedly inland. By afternoon, Flaxborough's appetite for a convenient culprit had ripened into certainty. The Gazette's proofs contained editorial warnings about the dangers of anonymous sabotage to civic pride. Mrs. Dymock had discovered that Miss Larkin sometimes worked alone at the library after hours. The evidence against her had crystallized with suspicious neatness. Too neat, Purbright reflected, like pieces of a puzzle forced into place by an impatient hand. In his office, he arranged the day's discoveries: the anonymous warning, the missing BBC toolkit, the fisherman's bend knot, the adjusted typewriter ribbon. Each piece suggested someone had taken considerable care to ensure the trail led toward Miss Larkin while concealing their own involvement. "Too convenient," Love said, echoing his thoughts. "Like someone's laid out clues for us to follow." "Indeed," Purbright agreed. "The question becomes, who benefits from Miss Larkin appearing guilty, and what are they hoping we won't notice while we're looking in her direction?" He drew 3 names on his blotter: Larkin, Spinks, Pallithorpe, then added a 4th in smaller script: Ferris. Below them, almost without thinking, he sketched a simple anchor, the kind that might secure a boat or bind a secret. The church clock struck 5, and Purbright locked his desk, knowing that tomorrow would require a more direct approach to untangling what someone had taken maritime precision to knot. The evening light slanted through his window, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny secrets, each carrying its own small truth toward an inevitable settling. In Flaxborough, he reflected, the most interesting crimes often arose not from grand passions, but from the patient accumulation of small grievances, like barnacles growing quietly beneath the waterline until they threatened the vessel's progress entirely. Morning brought the particular clarity that follows a night of careful consideration. Purbright had spent the small hours arranging and rearranging the evening's discoveries like a patient chess player studying an opponent's seemingly casual moves. The anonymous warning about shadows and bright lights suggested someone wished him to look beyond the obvious, though whether from genuine concern or calculated misdirection remained to be determined. Mrs. Palathorpe received them in a drawing-room where every surface had been arranged to suggest both prosperity and cultural refinement. She poured tea with the ceremonial precision of someone conducting a diplomatic negotiation, her movements suggesting that even domestic rituals could be managed with military efficiency. "Inspector," she said, settling herself with the confidence of someone who had anticipated this conversation, "I trust you're making satisfactory progress with our theatrical saboteur. The town is quite naturally anxious for resolution." "We're pursuing several interesting lines of inquiry," Purbright replied with diplomatic vagueness. "Your keys, Mrs. Palathorpe. We understand they provide access to various municipal facilities." She gestured toward a small table where her key ring lay beside correspondence materials. Purbright noted a faint smear of black paint on one key and the distinctive metallic scent that suggested recent contact with machinery or tools. "Committee responsibilities," she explained smoothly. "The Corn Exchange, library storage, council cupboards. A woman in my position must be everywhere at once." Her smile suggested that being everywhere was both a burden and a privilege she bore with appropriate dignity. "You also maintain extensive correspondence," Love observed, noting the neat stack of letters and the quality Remington typewriter positioned with military precision. "My late husband left me excellent equipment," Mrs. Palathorpe replied. "I correspond with theatrical societies throughout the region. One must keep abreast of cultural developments." She paused, then added with careful emphasis, "I've been particularly interested in incidents of sabotage in amateur productions. Such behavior appears to be more common than one might hope." Purbright examined a program lying near the typewriter, noting that "C Voices, Miss Constance Larkin," had been circled with decisive pencil strokes. "Miss Larkin's monologue was cancelled, we understand." "Unfortunately necessary," Mrs. Palathorpe said with the regretful authority of someone making difficult but correct decisions. The piece was too intimate for radio. Wireless demands projection, confidence. Miss Larkin, though diligent, lacks the necessary presence for public performance. "At the Corn Exchange, Mr." Prindle had been conducting his morning consultation with dust and disorder. He led them to the stage area where the previous evening's arrangements had been restored to municipal respectability, though traces of the investigation remained like archaeological evidence of recent disturbance. "Lighting systems being checked," Prindle reported with professional satisfaction. "Footlights work proper, though they do cast some fierce shadows along the back wall. Someone moving careful light could travel the whole width of the stage and never be seen from the seats." Purbright activated the footlights, watching as they carved the stage into areas of brilliant illumination and deep shadow. The narrow corridor along the back wall became a perfect avenue for unseen movement, connecting the fly tower with the BBC equipment station and Mr. Tudge's prompt corner. "Convenient geography," he observed, noting how someone familiar with the layout could access every point of sabotage while remaining invisible to the audience. Near the radiator, chalk from Mr. Spinks's stage markings had preserved the impression of a heel, not the broad working boot of Mr. Ferris or the practical shoe of Mr. Tudge, but something narrower, more refined. At Rose Cottage, They found Miss Larkin pale but present, her voice reduced to a whisper that suggested genuine distress rather than theatrical affectation. Mrs. Grimble, her landlady, hovered with the protective concern of someone whose tenant had become unexpectedly fragile. "The note about my monologue," Miss Larkin whispered, showing them a small bandage on her finger. "It was left in a returned library book. Not tonight. I thought it meant the piece wasn't suitable." She paused, touching the bandage carefully. "I was adjusting costume pins when I heard about the cable." My hand slipped. Purbright noted the window cord, finished with the precise seamanship her father had taught her, and the small sewing kit containing dressmaker's pins identical to the one used in the message to Mr. Tudge. Everything pointed toward her with suspicious convenience, like signposts planted by someone who understood exactly where investigators would look. "Miss Larkin," he said gently, "did you notice anyone else moving backstage during the evening?" Anyone who seemed familiar with the layout. She considered this carefully, her pale eyes focusing with the intensity of someone trying to remember details through distress. Mrs. Palathorpe was everywhere, as usual. She had her keys and seemed to be checking things, and I thought I saw someone near the fly tower just before Mr. Tudge fell, but the shadows were so deep. Back at the railway yard, Ferris provided technical observations with the detached precision of someone whose work depended on noticing when things weren't quite right. "That BBC assistant," he said, wiping grease from his hands, seemed nervous when he returned my cable cutters. Kept looking toward the sandbags like he expected to see something. And Mr. Malison, too calm by half if you ask me. Like a man who'd been expecting trouble. At the station, Love reported that Whitfields had indeed sold a typewriter ribbon the previous week. To the library, though Miss Tiddy insisted she hadn't changed it. "Someone did, though," he added. "It's printing clear as a church bell now." Purbright arranged the day's discoveries on his desk with the methodical care of someone assembling a mechanism whose operation was becoming increasingly clear. The paint-smeared key, the convenient evidence pointing toward Miss Larkin, the systematic misdirection of the conversations, the technical knowledge required for the precise sabotage. "Someone," he said to Love, "has invested considerable effort in ensuring we reach the obvious conclusion about Miss Larkin. The question becomes, what are we not meant to notice while we're looking in her direction?" The evening light slanted through his office window, creating its own patterns of illumination and shadow. In Flaxborough, Purbright reflected, the most interesting crimes often arose not from passionate impulses, but from the patient accumulation of small grievances and the methodical application of considerable intelligence to their resolution. Tomorrow, he decided, would require a more direct examination of who benefited most from Miss Larkin's apparent guilt and what they hoped to accomplish beyond the simple disruption of a cultural evening. The church clock struck 6, and somewhere in the gathering dusk, he suspected, someone was congratulating themselves on a plan proceeding exactly as intended. Morning brought the particular clarity that follows a night of methodical consideration. Purbright had arranged his thoughts like a patient chess player studying an opponent's seemingly casual moves, and had concluded that someone in Flaxborough possessed both considerable theatrical knowledge and an unfortunate talent for misdirection. The anonymous warning about shadows and bright lights suggested either genuine concern or calculated guidance toward a predetermined conclusion. He proposed to Love something that sounded so innocuous that everyone would agree to it immediately. A quiet walk-through at the Corn Exchange, with the principal participants recreating their positions from the evening of the incident. Mrs. Palathorpe embraced the idea with the efficiency of someone who preferred to manage rather than be managed. Mr. Spinks accepted on the understanding that he would provide artistic direction. Mr. Prindle nodded with the resigned competence of someone who would ultimately make it all work. Miss Larkin sent word, delivered by Mrs. Grimble's careful handwriting, that she remained under Dr. Hockley's care for her throat condition. The note included an apology perfectly proportioned to her character, along with Mrs. Grimble's sharper postscript that the young lady would not be overtaxing herself with unnecessary exertions. By 11 o'clock, the Corn Exchange had assumed its daytime personality. Pale light through high windows, the settled smell of old wood not yet challenged by human importance. Mr. Malison and his assistant Pearce were present, coiling their professional independence into neat loops. Ferris leaned against the stage, with the watchful gravity of a man prepared to observe others making predictable mistakes. "Let us establish positions," Mrs. Palathorpe announced with gloved efficiency. "Mr. Mayor stood here, Mr. Tudge there, microphone positioned thus." She indicated locations with the authoritative precision of someone conducting a military exercise disguised as cultural inquiry. Mr. Prindle activated the footlights, and sudden brightness carved the stage into brilliant pools and deep shadows. The rear corridor, where wall met curtain, became a dark avenue that could swallow movement entirely. Purbright positioned himself slightly apart, as was his custom, watching the way Mrs. Palathorpe's heels struck the boards with small, decisive taps. On one heel, he noticed a tiny hesitation in the rhythm, as if the rubber tip had been replaced recently and not quite properly seated. "Mr. Tudge appears to be delayed," Mrs. Palathorpe observed, consulting her watch with the disapproval of someone whose schedules were not suggestions. They did not have time to worry about punctuality. Something shifted in the darkness above, an alteration in the weight of air that only people familiar with stage rigging would notice. Ferris straightened immediately. "Mind yourselves," he said in the tone of someone advising against stepping into traffic. One of the sandbags descended, not falling but moving with the controlled precision of deliberate release. It struck the stage where a person might reasonably have been standing, with a thump that sent dust rising into the footlights like offended spirits. Mr. Prindle, who had been unfortunate enough to exist near the impact point, stumbled backward with a breathless observation about the ancestry of inanimate objects. The sandbag lay still and accusatory while dust settled with democratic impartiality. "Good heavens!" Mrs. Palathorpe exclaimed, taking 2 elegant steps backward with the practiced precision of someone well rehearsed in strategic retreat. Ferris had already reached the cleat where the rope was secured. "Someone's released this deliberate-like," he announced, examining the arrangement, then tried to make it look proper afterwards. "Not Mr. Prindle's work. He ties honest knots." Purbright approached the cleat and discovered, pinned beside it with another dressmaker's pin, a small strip of paper bearing 2 words, "Not today." The typing was crisp and professional. The T held its position with perfect dignity. Miss Larkin's machine would never produce such clear type, Love observed quietly. "Indeed not," Purbright agreed, turning the pin thoughtfully. He glanced toward Mrs. Palathorpe's key ring, which she clutched reflexively before allowing it to dangle. The same key bore the same faint black smear he had noted previously. Near the cleat, where some careless hand had once brushed wet paint, the wood showed a fresh fingerprint of identical black, recently transferred and hastily smudged. At that moment, Mr. Tudge arrived in a state of breathless indignation. "Blame the Postal Service," he declared before anyone could speak. "They've returned my registered letter. Insufficient address, if you can credit such incompetence." He produced the envelope with the wounded dignity of someone whose faith in institutional efficiency had been betrayed. Purbright examined it with interest, noting that the intended recipient was not a legal firm, but Whitfield's Stationery Supplies, regarding payment for theatrical programs printed on credit. The morning's second discovery came from Pierce, who had been conducting his own nervous investigation of the stage area. He produced, wrapped in brown paper, a small pair of cable cutters. "Found these hidden under the prompt corner," he said miserably. "Part of our missing tool kit." "Conveniently placed for discovery," Purbright observed, examining the clean jaws, "and positioned to implicate Mr. Tudge's area of operations. Dr. Hockley's timely arrival provided Miss Larkin with an alibi of unimpeachable medical authority. He confirmed that she had been in his surgery throughout the morning, receiving treatment for vocal strain and strict instructions about avoiding all forms of excitement or exertion. "Then it cannot be Miss Larkin," Mr. Spinks said with visible relief. Mrs. Palathorpe's expression suggested that medical evidence, while inconvenient, could not be dismissed entirely. "There are other explanations," she began, but found herself standing on increasingly uncertain ground. At Whitfield Stationery, the proprietor confirmed with commercial precision that Mrs. Palthorpe had indeed purchased a new typewriter ribbon 2 days before the Corn Exchange incident. "High-quality ribbon," he noted with professional pride. "Produces very clear, even type, much superior to the old one she brought in for comparison." "She specifically requested the clearest possible impression?" Love asked. "Indeed. Said she had important correspondence that required perfect presentation." Back at the station, Purbright arranged the morning's discoveries with methodical care. The planted cable cutters, the professionally typed note, the new typewriter ribbon, the systematic misdirection of evidence toward Miss Larkin. Everything pointed toward someone with both technical knowledge and considerable organizational ability. "Mrs. Palathorpe emerges as remarkably well prepared," he observed to Love. "New typewriter ribbon for clear messages, access to all areas of the Corn Exchange, detailed knowledge of everyone's movements and responsibilities." "And motive?" Love asked. Purbright considered the cancelled monologue, the systematic undermining of Miss Larkin's confidence, the careful orchestration of public embarrassment. "Control," he said finally. "Mrs. Dine. Palathorpe appears to be someone who cannot tolerate situations she cannot manage or people who might upstage her cultural authority." The church clock struck noon, and somewhere in Flaxborough, he reflected, someone was discovering that their carefully orchestrated campaign of misdirection had attracted rather more official attention than intended. The evidence was crystallizing around Mrs. Palathorpe with the same suspicious convenience that had previously pointed toward Miss Larkin, except that this time the trail led towards someone with both means and opportunity. Tomorrow, he decided, would require a more direct conversation about typewriter ribbons, maritime knots, and the curious coincidence of evidence that appeared exactly where and when it would prove most damaging to the town's most convenient scapegoat. Morning arrived with the particular clarity that follows a night of methodical consideration. Purbright had arranged his thoughts like a patient chess player studying an opponent's seemingly casual moves, and had concluded that someone in Flaxborough possessed both considerable theatrical knowledge and an unfortunate talent for misdirection. The systematic campaign against Miss Larkin had been executed with administrative precision, but precision, like handwriting, often betrayed its author through characteristic flourishes. He began, as he often did, by asking an apparently tedious question of an apparently tedious man. Mr. Kettle, the council clerk, inhabited an office that smelled of paper, floor polish, and the particular resignation of municipal life. He produced an access log whose columns reduced civic responsibility to neat tick marks. "Corn Exchange entries," Kettle reported with bureaucratic satisfaction. "Caretaker Prindle, naturally. Myself for monthly inspections. Mrs. Palathorpe, quite frequently, Inspector. She prefers to verify arrangements personally. 2 evenings last week, Wednesday and Friday." He paused over his own careful handwriting. "Also Mayor Mallow on Thursday, consulting about curtain adjustments. His firm supplied the velvet, you understand." "Indeed," Purbright murmured. "And recent purchases?" "Emergency authorization from Mrs. Palathorpe for black stage paint, non-reflective finish for cleats and hardware. Nothing shouts provincial like glossy fittings," she explained. "Quite persuasive about appearances, Mrs. Palathorpe." At Whitfield Stationery, the proprietor confirmed with commercial precision that Mrs. Pallithorpe had purchased a premium typewriter ribbon 2 days before the incident. Specifically requested the clearest possible impression, he noted with professional pride. Said she had important correspondence requiring perfect presentation. Also ordered a second batch of programs that same day. Change of running order, Miss Larkin's item removed entirely. Love reported additional intelligence gathered from strategic listening in public places. Mrs. Pallithorpe's been at the post office, asking about requirements for registered legal correspondence. Seemed quite agitated when told that returned mail. Indicated addressing errors rather than postal incompetence. This detail settled into Purbright's mental collection with satisfying precision. Mrs. Pallithorpe's cultural authority depended upon maintaining seamless organizational competence, while administrative failures represented the kind of public embarrassment she could not acknowledge. At Rose Cottage, they found Miss Larkin considerably recovered and possessed of information she had been too distressed to share previously. Dr. Hockley's treatment had included mild sedation that had, paradoxically, clarified her memory of recent events. "The evening before the performance," she said, her voice still whisper-soft but gaining strength, "I stayed late at the library to finish labeling. I heard someone using the typewriter in the main room. When I looked, Mrs. Pallithorpe was there with what appeared to be the old ribbon, examining it very carefully." She paused, touching her bandaged finger. "Later, leaving through the back entrance, I noticed her at the Corn Exchange with her keys, checking stage arrangements." "Back at the Corn Exchange, mister?" Prindle had been conducting his morning consultation with dust and mechanical evidence. He led them to the fly tower, where tool marks on the sandbag rigging told their own story of deliberate manipulation. "Professional adjustment work," he explained, indicating scratches on metal where precision tools had been applied. "But they left marks that matched the pattern on Mrs. Pallithorpe's key ring. She's been using keys to adjust mechanical systems they weren't designed for." Purbright examined the stage area with renewed attention to detail. The footlights, raised to performance brightness, carved the space into precise areas of illumination and concealment. Along the rear wall, where velvet met painted surface, he found by touch rather than sight the complaint of wood bearing repeated impact. Narrow heel marks, once firm, once repositioned for better balance. The paint evidence proved particularly revealing. A small smudge of black enamel on Mrs. Pallithorpe's key ring had transferred to the stage cleat, then to various surfaces in her own home. A trail of microscopic evidence linking her directly to the sabotage sites. Ferris, encountered at the railway yard, provided the day's most significant discovery. A small notebook wedged behind the tool cabinet, containing detailed observations about Arts Circle members, their vulnerabilities, and financial irregularities. The handwriting was precise and administrative, the kind used for committee minutes and cultural correspondence. "Someone's been conducting systematic intelligence gathering," Ferris observed with professional admiration. "Like military reconnaissance, but aimed at amateur dramatics." At the library, Miss Tiddy confirmed that the typewriter ribbon had been changed without authorization, sometime between Tuesday closing and Wednesday opening. Perfect installation by someone who knew exactly which type we used. But they left the damaged old ribbon in the wastepaper basket, either careless or deliberately discoverable. By afternoon, Purbright had ceased accumulating evidence and begun analyzing patterns. Mrs. Pallithorpe emerged as someone for whom control was both profession and compulsion. Her meticulous organization, tireless committee work, and impeccable social presentation were declarations of competence and unassailable authority. The idea that this authority might be challenged, even subtly, by someone as unassuming as Miss Larkin represented an intolerable threat to her carefully constructed position. Miss Larkin, with her quiet talent and unconscious grace, embodied a natural authority that Mrs. Pallithorpe, for all her efforts, could never quite achieve. The cancelled monologue, the systematic undermining of confidence, the elaborate misdirection. These were not random acts of malice, but the calculated dismantling of a perceived rival. The evidence against Mrs. Palathorpe, he explained to Love, is comprehensive and convincing. Technical knowledge, administrative access, financial motive, physical proof. Yet something troubles me about its convenient completeness. Too neat, Love suggested. Precisely. Mrs. Palathorpe is intelligent enough to avoid such obvious traces, unless— He paused, considering. Unless the obviousness itself serves a purpose. Someone who understands how investigations proceed might deliberately leave a trail, confident that their reputation for competence would deflect suspicion until the evidence became overwhelming. The church clock struck 4, and Purbright made his decision. Tomorrow would require the kind of direct but courteous confrontation that separated genuine guilt from elaborate performance. He would present Mrs. Palathorpe with a question, seemingly innocuous but precisely calculated, that would reveal whether her careful construction of evidence represented genuine criminal carelessness or the supreme confidence of someone who believed their social position rendered them effectively invisible. In Flaxborough, he reflected, the most interesting crimes often arose not from passionate impulses, but from the patient accumulation of small grievances and the methodical application of considerable intelligence to their resolution. Mrs. Palathorpe had orchestrated her campaign with the same efficiency she brought to cultural events. But efficiency, like everything else in small towns, eventually became visible to those who knew where to look. Morning brought the particular clarity that follows a night of methodical consideration. Purbright had concluded that the time for indirect inquiry had passed, though his approach would remain characteristically oblique. He arranged a small gathering in his office, extending invitations with the polite firmness of someone who expected compliance. The purpose, he explained, was to clarify final points, now that Miss Larkin had been definitively cleared of suspicion. Mrs. Palathorpe arrived with her customary efficiency, followed by Mr. Spinks, who entered with theatrical dignity, and Mr. Tudge, still wearing his bandage like a badge of civic service. Mr. Mallison from the B.B.C. completed the assembly, his thin frame lending professional detachment to the proceedings. Purbright began by producing the anonymous note that had appeared beneath his door. The truth is not what it appears. Look to the shadows cast by bright lights, he read aloud, his voice conversational. Curious guidance, wouldn't you agree? Particularly given how subsequent events have directed our attention with such precision toward Mrs. Palathorpe. Mrs. Palathorpe straightened slightly. Inspector, surely you're not suggesting this note constitutes evidence of any kind? Not evidence precisely, Purbright replied, his gaze moving thoughtfully across the assembled faces. More a form of guidance, or perhaps misdirection. The evidence we've discovered, the cut cable, the specific knots, the planted toolkit, the typed messages, all point with remarkable elegance toward Mrs. Palathorpe, almost as if designed to do so. Mr. Spinks cleared his throat with nervous precision. Inspector, the evidence does seem quite conclusive. Mrs. Palathorpe's access, her administrative capabilities— Indeed, Purbright interrupted gently, his eyes lingering on Spinks with mild interest. Her capabilities are beyond question, which raises an intriguing possibility. What if someone with equal cunning anticipated precisely that conclusion? Someone who understood that Mrs. Palathorpe's reputation for meticulous organization would make her an ideal candidate for suspicion. The suggestion settled into the office like dust disturbing carefully arranged surfaces. Mrs. Palathorpe remained composed, though her breathing had become slightly more deliberate. Mr. Tudge shifted uncomfortably. Spinks spoke again, his voice carrying a note of theatrical authority. But, Inspector, to suggest elaborate framing requires considerable malice and plotting. Who in our quiet town would possess such theatrical cunning? He gestured dismissively. Who would benefit from destroying Mrs. Pallythorpe's reputation so systematically? Precisely the question, Purbright said softly, that we've been asking ourselves. Who indeed would benefit from such a carefully constructed narrative? And who, having orchestrated it, might feel compelled to send anonymous guidance to ensure the investigation reached the intended conclusion? He lifted the note again, studying it with renewed interest. This was typed on the library machine, using the new ribbon that Mrs. Pallythorpe purchased. But who would have access to that machine, knowledge of the ribbon's replacement, and sufficient theatrical imagination to craft such provocative guidance? Spink's carefully maintained composure began to show hairline cracks. His eyes darted toward Mrs. Pallythorpe, then away, seeking confirmation of an understanding that was not forthcoming. The muscle in his jaw twitched with barely suppressed tension. The anonymous note suggests someone wished us to look beyond obvious conclusions, Purbright continued with deceptive mildness. Yet it also demonstrates intimate knowledge of our investigation's progress. Someone has been watching our inquiry unfold, perhaps even guiding it, while maintaining the appearance of helpful cooperation. Spinks opened his mouth, then closed it without speaking, his gaze fixed on the anonymous note with uncomfortable intensity, as if recognizing something he had hoped would remain hidden. The theatrical mask he wore so comfortably had begun to slip, revealing beneath it the expression of someone whose carefully constructed performance was being subjected to unexpectedly critical review. Purbright folded the note with deliberate care. "Tomorrow," he said pleasantly, "we shall discuss the curious mathematics of theatrical plotting and the particular skills required to orchestrate such an elaborate misdirection." The test, it seemed, had yielded its intended results with quiet but unmistakable precision. The others departed with the particular awkwardness of people who had witnessed something they could not quite name, leaving only Mr. Spinks, who lingered with the studied casualness of someone who had forgotten something important but could not quite remember what. His theatrical posture remained carefully arranged, though hairline cracks had begun to show in the performance. "Inspector," Spinks said, adjusting his dignity with visible effort, "this suggestion of elaborate framing, surely the evidence against Mrs. Pallythorpe speaks for itself." "Indeed it does," Purbright agreed with deceptive mildness. "It speaks with remarkable eloquence, almost as if someone with considerable dramatic imagination had composed its testimony." He settled back in his chair with the patience of a man who understood that the best revelations, like the best theatrical moments, required proper timing. "Tell me, Mr. Spinks, what distinguishes amateur plotting from professional misdirection?" The question struck home with visible impact. Spinks colored slightly, his carefully maintained composure showing additional stress fractures. "I'm afraid I don't follow your meaning, Inspector." "Amateur plotting," Purbright continued conversationally, "tends toward obvious solutions and melodramatic gestures. A single villain, a single motive, evidence that points in one direction only. Professional misdirection, however, creates layers of deception, each more sophisticated than the last. Rather like your theatrical productions, carefully rehearsed performances designed to guide the audience toward predetermined conclusions." Purbright produced the two notes, laying them side by side on his desk like evidence in a peculiar trial. "Consider these messages. The first, 'Not tonight,' typed on the library machine with its characteristic drooping T, pinned to Mr. Tudge with Miss Larkin's dressmaker's pin, the slip knot that entangled him, suggesting general seamanship knowledge that Miss Larkin might possess through her father's profession." He paused, watching Spink's expression with mild interest. The perfect frame for a shy librarian. Too perfect, perhaps, for anyone who understood that obvious solutions rarely survive careful scrutiny. So a second layer was required. "The second note," Purbright continued, lifting the "not today" message, typed with admirable clarity on Mrs. Palathorpe's new Remington ribbon. The fisherman's bend securing the sandbag. More specialized knowledge than a simple slip knot. The planted B.B.C toolkit, the black paint transferred from her keys to the stage cleats. Evidence pointing not to amateur malice, but to administrative cunning. Spinks remained silent, though his breathing had become audibly strained. His eyes fixed on the notes with the uncomfortable intensity of someone recognizing their own handwriting in an incriminating document. 2 layers of deception, Purbright observed, each designed to discredit the previous suspect and establish a new one. First Miss Larkin, then Mrs. Palathorpe. But who possessed the theatrical knowledge to orchestrate such elaborate misdirection? Who had access to all the necessary areas, understood the technical requirements for precise sabotage, and could move unseen through the Corn Exchange during both preparation and execution? The theatrical director's carefully constructed persona continued its visible dissolution. What remained beneath was a man whose real performance had been the maintenance of innocence while secretly orchestrating an elaborate campaign of revenge. You researched maritime knots for your productions, Purbright continued with relentless courtesy. You borrowed Mrs. Palathorpe's keys for rehearsal purposes and returned them conveniently marked with stage paint. You accessed the library after hours to type the first message, then used Mrs. Palathorpe's machine for the second. You even sent me anonymous guidance to ensure I would see through the obvious evidence and appreciate the subtlety of your construction. Spink's composure finally cracked entirely. "You don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Palathorpe was destroying everything we'd built. Her interference, her constant management, she was suffocating the artistic vision of our productions. Someone had to demonstrate that true control lies not in committees and budgets, but in the subtle manipulation of events. So you decided to stage her public disgrace," Purbright said, his tone remaining conversational despite the gravity of the admission. "A carefully orchestrated performance designed to discredit her authority and establish your own supremacy in the arts circle." "It was meant to be elegant," Spinks protested, his theatrical nature asserting itself even in defeat. "A demonstration of superior intellect, of artistic vision triumphing over administrative tyranny." The anonymous note was a final flourish, to ensure you understood the true artistry involved, to confirm that you, at least, would appreciate the subtlety of the execution. "A test," Purbright observed mildly, "of my powers of deduction." "How flattering. And yet, Mr. Spinks, I fear your theatrical masterpiece has revealed rather more about the playwright than the characters he sought to manipulate." The church clock struck noon, and somewhere in Flaxborough the curtain was finally falling on a performance that had considered itself the finest of the season. Love moved with quiet efficiency, and Mr. Spinks, his final bow complete, allowed himself to be escorted from the stage with the dignity of someone who had, at least, been accused with considerable style. The council chamber provided the appropriate gravity for conclusions, its municipal dignity lending weight to revelations that might otherwise seem merely theatrical. Purbright had arranged the principles with the careful precision of someone who understood that explanations, like good drama, required proper staging. Mrs. Palathorpe sat with vindicated composure, Miss Larkin maintained her quiet grace, and Mr. Tudge wore his bandage like a badge of civic service. "What occurred at the Corn Exchange," Purbright began with characteristic understatement, "was not spontaneous mischief, but carefully orchestrated performance art. Mr. Spinks constructed a drama in 3 acts, each designed to direct suspicion toward a predetermined target. He placed the evidence before them with methodical care. Act 1 featured Miss Larkin as the obvious suspect, the "Not Tonight" message, typed on the library machine with its distinctive drooping T, pinned with her dressmaker's pins. The slip knot that entangled Mr. Tudge, suggesting nautical knowledge her father might have taught her. Even her cancelled monologue provided motive for resentment. Mrs. Palithorpe shifted slightly, recognizing the precision of the construction that had nearly ensnared her. Act 2 elevated the sophistication, Purbright continued. When the first frame proved too obvious, Mr. Spinks provided a more compelling alternative. Mrs. Palithorpe's administrative access, her new typewriter ribbon producing the crystal-clear "Not today" message, the fisherman's bend demonstrating specialized seamanship knowledge, the planted B.B.C. toolkit, the transferred stage paint, all pointing toward someone with both means and opportunity. Mr. Spinks, present in custody, maintained the dignified bearing of someone whose artistic vision had been thoroughly, if regrettably, exposed. The anonymous guidance was Act 3, Purbright observed, lifting the final note. Mr. Spinks could not resist ensuring that his elaborate construction received proper appreciation. The suggestion to look to the shadows cast by bright lights was both literal direction and artistic vanity, a playwright's need for his work to be understood. Love stood quietly by the door, solid and reassuring in his official capacity. The technical execution was admirable, Purbright acknowledged with professional courtesy. Maritime knots learned from theatrical research, administrative access borrowed through committee responsibilities, evidence planted with theatrical timing. Mr. Spinks understood that the best misdirection operates in layers, each more sophisticated than the last. The mayor cleared his throat with municipal authority. And the motive, Inspector? Control, Purbright replied simply. Mr. Spinks found himself increasingly marginalized by Mrs. Palithorpe's administrative efficiency and Miss Larkin's quiet competence. Rather than compete directly, he chose to orchestrate their mutual destruction while positioning himself as the sole remaining cultural authority. In the days that followed, Flaxborough processed this revelation with its customary blend of satisfaction and mild disappointment. The truth, while intellectually satisfying, lacked the dramatic simplicity the town had hoped for. Mrs. Palithorpe resumed her committee work with renewed, if slightly tempered, authority. Miss Larkin returned to the library with quiet dignity intact. Mr. Tudge discovered that surviving theatrical sabotage enhanced his reputation considerably. The Corn Exchange stood empty in the afternoon light, its velvet curtains hanging with restored dignity. Mr. Prindle had removed all traces of investigation, returning the space to its patient expectation of future, hopefully less complicated, cultural events. Inspector Purbright returned to his desk in the comfortable routine of paperwork. He filed the reports with satisfaction, reflecting that even the most elaborate theatrical plotting eventually yielded to methodical police work and the simple application of common sense to uncommon circumstances. The church clock struck 5, marking another day's end in a town that had briefly entertained criminal masterminds, but settled with characteristic pragmatism for a theatrical director whose artistic ambitions had exceeded his moral boundaries. The end.